Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the War Report. Hopefully, my audio quality is a bit better this week. I just got a new headset. My last one had actually busted the night I did the show, so it was only half functional, and it was the only one I had. So hopefully, that didn't sound too terrible. It was a bit quiet for my taste, but without further ado, we'll get right into it. I am, of course, Constantine Martelli. We have GSP right here. I will once again remind you to check out our alternative platforms, which we will link below, which we're going to also post the show. So if you don't like watching it here, or if something happens here, you can still listen to the show elsewhere. But without further ado, we have quite a bit of news just over the course of the
Yeah,
past week or so. So the big news is, of course, out of Ukraine. This is news from Monday, actually, and this will be premiering Friday evening. So Shabbat Shalom to all of our Jewish viewers, once again, as always. So the case was, and I'm sure you'll have plenty to say about this, as will I. There was missiles that landed in eastern Poland. Now, of course, first everyone said this was a deliberate attack by Russia. They're trying to expand this war. They're going after Poland because they support Ukraine. Blah 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 blah.
and they started with Polish farmers.
Yeah, that poor tractor. I hope
Putin is
that
so evil. He's like, I fucking hate their tractors.
it's it really is a war among Slavs. The tractors are the first casualties. You know, they say in war, truth is the first casualties. Well, they got the wrong TR word. That's tractors actually, and it's very sad. You know, I come
That's
from I look
brilliant.
I grew up in a farming area, so tractors are very near and dear to my heart. But I mean, overall, it's very sad what happened to that tractor. I hope that Polish man gets reimbursed. I believe, and I don't know if this report was recanted in all seriousness. I believe there were two casualties. Now, in terms of whether that was just
Yes, two
injury,
people were killed.
yes, I heard that there were two deaths from it. I don't think there were any other injuries, but almost immediately, of course, the media circuit jumps into this was deliberate Russian action. Then it comes out that these were S-300 missiles. S-300s, as longtime viewers of the war report will know, are air defense systems, and they're not an offensive weapon. Now, I don't know too much about them if they could be repurposed for that, but once again, you would assume if Russia were to do something like this that they would have something maybe a bit more suitable for this, unless, of course, you believe that Russia's running out of rockets, though they're so desperate. The largest military industrial complex in the world suddenly has ammunition and missile shortages, if you believe that. But then more came out that it was consistent with a Soviet era piece of technology that would have been used by the Ukrainians and has been used by the Ukrainians before. So that starts to get shoved under the rug. Initially, you have a lot of strong cries out of places like Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, the countries that you would expect from this countries that have been like, I believe you called them the rabid chihuahuas since the beginning of this, since before the beginning of this war, I should
Let's
say.
go to war. Article 4, Article 4. And then we can have Article 5.
Oh yeah,
I
yes,
mean, they were jumping on it right away, right away. And really, if it wasn't for someone who was there, who took photos of the wreckage of the missiles, that revealed the lettering and the look of the parts that did not disintegrate in the explosion. Um, I don't know what would have happened. It's uncertain what would have happened, but you can see just how desperate the Baltic states and Poland are ready to enlarge this war, to escalate it, and get NATO involved, and not least of which is Zelensky, who is still adamant that it is not a Ukrainian missile, that it is a Russian missile. I mean, he's winning. Why does he need NATO now? Um, so uh, it's quite bizarre because his generals are have come out and said, yeah, that's one of our missiles. He's been told by both Biden and not and Milley, but also what's his name, the other guy. Um,
Lloyd Austin.
yes, to stop with the rhetoric. It is a Ukrainian missile. Yeah, I mean the idea that the Americans were not tracking this missile and already knew. That it was not a Russian missile from the beginning is laughable. Of course, they knew. I mean, we all know they have American crews inside all the HIMARS that are firing, and they have all kinds of technical expertise that is there to help the Ukrainians,
Allow
right?
me to repeat
Not the
once
least of
again,
which,
Ukraine has been chocked full of NATO troops since 2014. People think this is a new development that you have American forces on the ground or you have that one Canadian general that was captured in Avestal. No, it's been since the Maidan. You have had NATO advisors and NATO trainers on the ground. And actually, there was an interesting clip that you had sent me of Poroshenko in a TV interview saying, "We just need the Minsk agreement to last long enough 4.5 years, 5 years for us to build up an army to NATO standards."
yes, that's right. And they were training between 3 to 5 brigades a year for 8 years, and that's still going on. Um, but what I find interesting about all of this is the question of, was this a false flag? Was this just an errant missile that tried to take out missiles that were headed towards Lvov? Uh, which one is it? You can see that because from what I understand, the incident happened 5 hours earlier before it made it to the news, which would mean that there was some kind of discussion about the narrative, right? And like I say, it's frightening to think that the only thing that stopped it was somebody posting pictures of it on social media, particularly Twitter, and this particular person is not pro-Russia, right? And why was America so quiet about it? You could look at it as maybe it was an opportunity. Maybe they thought, because let's face it, there are videos of both Russians and Ukrainians firing their S-300s, and the missile just goes in a totally weird direction. So that was inevitable that that was going to happen sooner or later. So
Especially once you got
maybe
more
it.
strikes westward in the country. And
What,
with yeah, with that
let's
being said, it is
yeah.
inevitable that something like this would happen. I recall a case from 2019 where Israeli missiles, there was, I believe, it was the either Syrian air defenses or the Iron Dome fired. So somewhere in Israel, Palestine, or Syria, air defense were launched, and you actually had missile fragments land in Cyprus. So these kind of things happen all
Yes,
the time.
that's right. Yeah. So it is one of those things that I think is predictive, right? It's predictable that this will happen in a war, especially a war that is as industrial and hot as this one.
But if I had to personally speculate, I would say that it was just a case of one of these missiles going wayward or some similar scenario with that, and the reason they sat on it for several hours is they decided how they wanted to spin it. Because if they were actually plotting something,
Yeah.
if they wanted to make the Poles think that, look what Russia did to your country, they would have had something concocted already that they could have ran within minutes, if even of the instant, and said, this is what happened, Russia did this, Russia's an aggressor, we need to escalate this war to stop them. But if they had to sit on it for that long, they realized, hey, an opportunity quite literally just fell out of the sky. How are we going to spend this?
Yeah, I think that is a scenario because like, or rather, that is the scenario because it does seem to have panned out that way, right? Like, you would think if it was a false flag attack, then they would have had more control on the ground. Someone blinked along the way, and I think, I'm not saying that it was America that blinked along the way, but they're probably the ones who told them to back off, right? Because this war is going to go on for a long time. And when people are talking about deals, I think what they really mean is truces that are not going to last. And it's going to be just a war of economic and uh, physical attrition.
Oh no, in many ways, except the fact that it's more conventional, it does mirror Syria in that sense, where there's a constant negotiation process, although the war is still
Yeah,
going on. Now, just because of how far things have been whittled down for the opposition in Syria, you see it starting to actually calm down. But you'll recall 2017, 2018, 2019, it was constant peace talks amidst the fighting. They would have a ceasefire that wouldn't even last 12 hours. And you could
right.
conceivably see a case in Ukraine where that does play out, where there's these tentative agreements that they reach a ceasefire while they're trying to negotiate something greater. Somebody breaks that ceasefire, it's off the table, they're back to square one. And that's the way that many post World War II wars have been fought. It's just that we haven't seen one of this size or scope since 1945. And I
Yeah.
mean, again,
Look, we want peace too. Psych.
I mean, you can point to Syria, you can point to Iraq, you can point to the various conflicts on the African continent, and the various conflicts in Central Asia, even just the low burn ones, and even when it comes to something much less conventional like the Colombian War against FARC, where that's the way these wars are conducted, and the only two differences I should say is that there's more conventional state actors involved now, and it's a state versus state rather than these irregular groups. And once again, the just size and scope of this conflict set it apart from that. So it is conceivable that this war could be dragged on for a very long time while the quote unquote peace process is ongoing.
Hmm, hmm. Yes. Yeah. So I think we said this off air, and if you want to define escalation as NATO troops do not enter Ukraine, uh, sorry, if you want to define that escalation is when NATO troops and American troops enter Ukraine, then that would, America on that count would have failed. They're contributing to the escalation. However, if you want to say that the escalation just means that the war does not spread outside of Ukraine, note that America's been hesitant to give any long range missiles for their HIMARS units. Then you can say that America, with that definition, has not escalated the war and is not interested in escalating the war. Um, I don't think they want that because I think in many ways that would they are afraid of Ukraine fatigue, and I think that in a way, if this had happened, let's say 5 to 8 months earlier, I think the resolve that would unify the EU countries and America against Russia would have been stronger. I think the game has changed now because I mean there was even a either a Lithuanian or an Estonian minister that on air said, my energy bills are 15%, 15 times higher than they were. This is outrageous. Uh, So I think the economic downturn that is there, um, that it's already taken root in the U.S. Um, I think that has mitigated the ability for a strong, unified action, and America is not interested, I don't think, to enter a directly, more directly than it already is, in Ukraine, because I think as soon as it begins to involve other European countries, I think the rest of Europe will begin to panic because it will only add on to the new difficult reality that Europe is being faced with.
I want to qualify this with it being very anecdotal, but just looking at the direction of the Twitter discourse, even among people who aren't necessarily too political, people who
Mm,
may consume mainstream media, whether it have a right bend or a left bend, just the normal mainstream people of society, you'll notice that whenever stories get put out now that Twitter's under new management, you always see much more critical responses about Zelensky and the Ukrainian government, but specifically Zelensky, whenever a new aid package is announced, whether he makes any media
Yes.
statements. People who, again, may have been completely behind the Ukrainian effort in February, March, even as late as, say, August, September, have grown disillusioned with it, have viewed it as a foreign conflict. The shock value of it, for lack of a better term, has worn off for the general public, and of course, the general public only has so much sway. Politicians will have to give some sort of baseline concession, but after that, they can do more or less whatever they want. But even among the political class, the novelty or the shock value has worn off. We discussed a few weeks before the midterms, there was that coalition of Democrats who called for a quote unquote de escalation in
Mm.
Ukraine. Biden and his cronies have been very hesitant to touch any of this. Even a lot of the European political establishment have been hesitant to touch any of this. And you'll recall, actually, for the past few months, Macron has been, I guess, counter signaling against a lot more of the hawkish rhetoric. Now, by no means do I believe that he wants any sort of amicable peace or any sort of real solution to this, but he does seem, and maybe that is his role. Maybe he's the controlled opposition in this. Maybe he's the moderate voice that they shove out there in order to get the happy compromise and push the needle ever so further in their direction. But at the end of the day, you're seeing less and less enthusiasm about this, and
Yeah, you're
especially
also
as
seeing more pushback. You're seeing people saying Zelensky is out of control. This could have gotten the whole world into a big mess, and he's lying. He needs to back down. There has to be cooler heads. Uh, I'm seeing way too much. Like I saw people who said that they were fervently supporting Ukraine through all of this, and they're saying this is irresponsible. They're also starting not to believe some of the stories that have emerged from Ukraine as well. Uh, just recently, I saw BBC about an hour ago released two videos about, and this was in quotes, uh, Russian torture chambers in Kherson. And I think, I mean, that's basically because the Bucha investigation is going nowhere. Ukraine refused to let the UN or anybody else investigate Bucha except the British. No surprise.
and
Then
then
they
there were
claimed that there
the
was a
power plant
massacre.
incidents that they refused to let
Yes,
the international investigators look into.
yes, yes. So, in a way, like the reason why Zelensky is doing this is because he's gotten away with it. He literally accused the Russians of shelling the nuclear power plant that is effectively under their control and is on their side, which is nonsense. And the media has complied. Like the media was also very willing to state, you know, publish completely fake headlines, right? Um, so it is a total irresponsibility.
And while
And
we're on the topic of the media narrative, I actually did see a follow up on the one story about the maternity hospital that they tried to make the big propaganda effort out of.
oh yeah, yeah,
And
yeah,
there was actually an independent journalist who tracked down this woman who is now living in Russia as a Russian citizen, mind you, who
right.
said that, like, yes, the hospital was shelled. I was there. I wasn't just a crisis actor. And then when the journalist actually talks to her, maybe you can chalk this up to her being inside Russia, whatever, blah blah blah, whatever cope people want to throw out there. Said that the
I
only
saw her say that when she was still in Mariupol.
yeah, saying that, like, yeah, the Ukrainians were the ones shelling the hospital, and uh, I have only ever been critical of the Ukrainian government going back even before the war started. So this random person, and they do this kind of thing all the time, just to the most unsuspecting people, and the people who would otherwise have nothing to do with this, turn them into propaganda machines. It was a really good thread. If I can find it again, I'll link it with the other
I,
links.
I do remember her, and I do remember us talking about her. The other interesting thing about all that is, oh, now I've just lost my train of thought. Um, yeah, maybe it'll come back.
Keep this
Yeah,
up, I'm
go
going to
ahead.
replace you. Hey, I look. I know a candidate, and you might know him too. But I will leave off the show closed doors discussions as just that. Other piece of Another couple pieces of news I want to touch on is I just have a couple more things to report about the missile incident. So you had Duda come out and said that the Ukrainians can observe the investigation into this, but they are not going to be partaking in it. And he had also
Yes.
reported that parts of the second missile did not land in Poland, despite initial reports. But even a country that has been, let's just say, at the forefront of this, as Poland has been one of the most supportive countries of Ukraine, is balking. Now, whether that's out of sheer pragmatism, which I would imagine it would be, or realizing the consequences of what an actual escalation would be, I don't know. But it does seem that now that rubber's hitting the road, now that you're actually getting a picture of reality, aside from a few hotheads in these countries, when it comes to the people actually tasked with making the decisions, they are much more hesitant to actually do this. Now, I have some more news about Poland and their energy industry later in the show when we get into more European news, but it is interesting just to see that play out.
Yeah, you have to wonder about what will the effect of this be, right? Um, in a way, this is really tapped down on the possibility of something of using something like this again. So this is more or less off the table now. I doubt it's going to be used again. And like I say, I think if it was a genuine false flag attack, somebody would be there because there was a whole number of hours. I saw someone write like this happened 5 hours ago. Somebody would have been there to plant the narrative,
Look, credit where credit is
right?
due. The Empire is good at crafting these narratives and having them out in record time.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, that's what makes me believe. I know Scott Ritter is convinced that this was a false flag that didn't work out. I'm just saying this was an opportunity, and that the Baltics and Poland are ready to pounce at any moment to escalate the war.
I also did see something,
For
and somebody brought this to
I mean,
my.
they tried. Lithuania tried with that passage to the land route to Kaliningrad, right? All of them have tried something to escalate the war. Ukraine tried with Transnistria. Remember, they were going to storm and take over Transnistria to get more
Oh, yes.
ammunition. They've all tried something to get to escalate the war, to bring NATO into the war.
And
But I don't think America wants that. I really think that America is thinking about China.
absolutely. And just a couple more things on Ukraine. Somebody else had brought this to my attention that actually earlier in the war, there was a similar incident where Ukraine had accidentally knocked a Romanian MiG out of the sky. And that story got swept
Yes.
under the rug. Everyone just conveniently forgot about that. That was like March, April, like really early in the war. And some people speculate now in retrospect that maybe that was an attempt at a false flag, or maybe it was once again just a malfunction of one of these systems. But
Remember the
this is,
Touch-Ku rocket that went all the way to Zagreb in Croatia?
oh yeah, yeah. I mean, this is far from the first incident like this to happen in this war. It just seemed that after, and once again, 5 hours deliberation, what was a malfunction turned into an opportunity. And perhaps that's a sign of desperation that they didn't do with the other two. Especially with, I would say the MiG was also one of the ones where they probably could have pushed that a lot further than they actually did, which is not at all. But
Hmm.
you see this. And then the last piece of Ukraine news I have is that there was a UN vote yesterday, which would have been November 16th, and it was regarding the quote unquote human rights situation in Crimea and Sevastopol. And the
Hmm.
voting tallies were 78 in favor of condemnation of Russia for X, Y, or Z, 14 against, and 79 abstentions. Now, I put zero stock in UN resolutions, especially when it comes to putting pressure on a larger country like Russia. Perhaps if we were talking about
Yeah.
a smaller nation such as a Syria or even Iran, that might be the different case. But the reason I bring this up is there's an interesting two interesting negative votes. So I'll start with the less interesting one. You had South Korea actually was on the same side as North Korea when it came to the vote on this, which I thought was shocking.
Yeah.
I mean, it is a complete vassal of the American Empire. You would not have expected that. And
Yeah.
actually, correction, they abstained, whereas North Korea was part of the negative vote. But the negative vote that I found most interesting was China. Now, traditionally, since the annexation of Crimea, China has tacitly sided with Russia by abstaining on these motions and more or less consent through being silent on the issue, to borrow
Mhm.
leftist terminology. But they had actually come out decisively on the side of Russia in this case, which once again goes to show that the supposed fragmentation of Russian Chinese relations that's supposed to happen any day now is likely far longer off than anyone would really expect, number one. Number two, it also shows that perhaps a greater solidarity is building, as you had alluded to, with greater focus being put on China, that they want to solidify what they do have with Russia and try to build on that even further. Now, I don't know when the day, if ever, that they will actually be a formal alliance, but it is once again implicitly understood that they have each other's backs for the time being, and their vote in concert with Russia on this, I would say only goes further that insofar as UN resolutions actually have any meaning.
Right, and there was another actually interesting UN vote. Now that you bring it up, and it was over the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant and the IAUA, and China sided with Russia. Let me just uh, quickly get my notes here. There were a few abstentions as well. Uh, yes, so Russia and China voted against. India, Kenya, Namibia, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, and Vietnam abstained. Brunei and Libya didn't vote. Like, it's kind of funny, Libya. Like, what's left of Libya? So,
And which Libyan government is even recognized by the UN? Is the Haftar or is the other one? I don't even know at this point.
yeah, yeah. So that didn't stand. And again, this was the Russians basically said that uh, that it was unprofessionally drafted resolution that goes beyond the agency's mandate and contains factual errors on nuclear safety and nuclear security and safeguards. What I'm guessing this is about is there was some people speculated that if there was a deal, Russia would give up the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, right? And the problem with that story all the time is, of course, is like you're told they've shut down all the reactors. 1 or 2 weeks will go by, and they'll say, "Oh, the third reactor and the fifth reactor have been shut off." It's like, wait a minute, I thought they were all shut off. I have it's one of the most baffling stories I've ever had to follow. But from what I understand, it's not like it has already been shut off, and Zelensky did try um, to make that a kind of a UN zone where neither side could go in, to get his foot in the door, because of course the area where Zaporozhye is on the south of the Dnieper is like a split halfway between Kherson and Mariupol. So if he can get his foot in the door there, he splits Crimea and Kherson away from Donbass, which is ultimately what he would want to do. And there is speculation that on the front, the Ukrainians are gearing up for that. But actually, the only kind of the only two noteworthy things that are happening on the front is the Russians have gained again a little bit more ground outside of uh, Svat, Svatovia. Like, let me, please forgive me. Um,
While you're looking for that, I will also announce, in terms of frontline news, after moving into the quote unquote liberated parts of Kherson, the Ukrainians immediately announced a mobilization of all men ages 18 to 55. Keep
yes,
in mind, these are the same men who were exempted from mobilization on the Russian side.
that's right. That's right.
Of course, infrastructure strikes do continue, and that led to power outages throughout the country, and even outside of the country, as Moldova also had power outages as a result of the infrastructure strikes on Ukraine over the past week.
Yeah, so it's in the Svatov direction. There's a and Kremenaya. So this is the area immediately adjacent to Krasny Liman that the Russians lost, I believe, in September. And there's an important north-south direction road that cuts through Svatov, and the Russians have pushed even a little further west than they did a few weeks ago. The other area of successes, now they have completely taken over the areas around Ugledar. Um, Pavlovka is now fully under their control, and the highway that connects them with the next town over, I think that might be Marinka, they control that now. And so there's like this incredibly slow success, but I'm not hearing any news about Bakhmut or Soledar. Uh, so the front lines are basically stable. The Russians are making some small gains in this area. Apparently, Ukrainian losses around Pavlovka Ugledar front have been heavy. Um, Again, there was also speculation that you're going to start seeing Ukrainians withdraw from there. I'm not actually seeing any of these things. Like a lot of people were speculating them. I had one night where I was making similar kind of speculations on friends on Telegram, and I think I was completely wrong. But and I think that comes down to with like Russia's move to leave you know, Kherson City. The interesting thing about that, I think we mentioned it on the last show, is that the night that they were leaving, one of the missiles did hit and uh, damage severely the dam of Novokhovka. Um, so water did start to drain from there. Now, were the Russians afraid that eventually the Ukrainians would like just flood the city anyways and just like, they've been hitting Novokhovka and Kherson and uh Enger, like the energy place. So I remember it. Uh like since June and July, right? So was that the reason? Some have speculated it's, the remaining 220,000 reservists that are going to be coming in. There's no point. My counter argument to that is there's nothing stopping the Ukrainians. If they thought the Russians were going to cross over in any significant numbers, they would blow up the dam and they would flood Kherson. No question. I'm seeing photos and videos of the average people of Kherson right now because the Russians in their retreat out of the city have blown up the energy infrastructure there. And people are waiting in line for water. Many of them don't have electricity and they're using public places to charge their phones and other devices. So now the Ukrainian army, of course, is well supplied, but um, you have a very dire situation, and I don't put it past the Ukrainians blowing up the dam if they thought that there was a chance that they would lose Kherson City. I
They've
just
certainly done worse thus far.
Right. I don't see it. So I think that argument that like, well, I mean, I'm sure they're waiting for like the 220,000 reservists. I think they're basically due in about 2 weeks. So, well, I guess we'll see what if some of these forecasts pan out.
Now, with all that being said, I do have quite a bit of European news if you're ready for that.
Hmm.
So I will start with Hungary, and it is a story that first and foremost does relate to Ukraine. That oil transit through Ukraine has been stopped, which has affected Hungarian supplies. Now, keep in mind that there are other pipelines that go there, namely Turk Stream, but they have lost that source as well. Now, despite that, you've had some interesting comments from the Hungarian Foreign Ministry regarding this. So, this statement actually came from the Prime Minister's office, saying that the actions of Zelensky has turned out to be irresponsible as he accused Russia of launching a missile attack into eastern Poland. All the Ukrainians were to blame for this incident. So you have right off the bat Hungarians coming out and saying that they don't believe for a minute that this was Russia. You have Peter Giarto, the foreign minister, coming out and saying, if it were not for our continued cooperation with Russia, our country would be in a miserable situation. Once again, referring to that energy situation. The other news you have out of Hungary is some inter European news in which they have come to terms with Austria and Serbia. And as we've covered previously, Serbian and Hungarian relations have improved greatly over the past year. And then adding Austria into that, trying to form a bloc. Now, all of these countries, while maybe you can say about Austria they haven't been fully on board with being anti Russia, I'll put it, or being pro Ukraine, they have been one of the Western countries that have been one of the less supportive ones. So they're once again signing deals with Serbia and Hungary and almost forming a bloc within Europe that is counter to the current establishment that is ruling over Europe. So that has been a development for quite some time now with the cooperation between the three. There was interesting complaining saying Austria and Hungary have left the West and are now sliding into despotism and
Hmm.
Orientalism and the usual news that you would get out of
Yeah,
there. But
ridiculous.
you are seeing a degree of pragmatism prevailing in Europe, at least some parts of Europe. Now, the other one is that Poland had requested more Russian oil and in order to again continue operations at one of the refineries, although the country has officially stated that it's going to be ending all Russian oil and all Russian energy imports by 2023. So you're starting to see a bit of capitulation with that. In Germany, you have the continued deindustrialization of the country. As we've stated previously, BASF is leaving the country. It is going to China and not the United States. And you outright have German politicians saying our country is facing deindustrialization, something that we, among many others, have also said you're actually hearing out of the words of German politicians at this point. And you had brought this to my attention, but it is interesting looking at the policy right now from the American empire as compared to Trump. So when you had Trump in office, his main goal was to encourage the divestment of companies in China, either into the United States or other allied Asian nations, whether that be Japan, South Korea, even increasingly Vietnam at this point, or even
Yeah, I was
India,
just gonna say.
as relations with India before the war in Ukraine were much warmer between the United States. Modi and Trump, at least on a individual to individual basis, seem to have a very productive professional relationship. But of course, that has decreased. Where under the Biden administration, under the new management of the American empire, at least temporarily, or at least new face of the American empire, I should say, you're seeing the exact opposite happen, where because of American policy in Europe, you're seeing the divestment from European countries. But while some have moved to the United States, while some have moved across the Atlantic, you're seeing just as many, if not more, moving eastward into Asia. So
Hmm.
it is almost a complete reversal of that in a sense where there was an attempt to pillage European resources while they could get their hands on them, which they did do to a degree of success, but in a either backfiring move or whatever you choose to believe about American Chinese relations and Biden's approach to China thus far, you've seen a lot of the industry go eastward, whether that be China. I believe some of it has even gone to India at this point. India, which has also been exempt from sanctions for its cooperation with Russia on energy issues as well. Now, the other big piece of European news I do have is that the conflict between Turkey and Greece, the potential for conflict, has increased greatly. Now, you had Erdogan coming out and giving one of his fiery speeches. Now, keep in mind, he is facing election next year, and next year is also the centennial of the foundation of the Turkish Republic, in which case he has several projects underway in order to do that. So, a lot of this could just be posturing in terms of popularity and wanting to project strength both at home and abroad. But you had him making statements such as a sudden overnight invasion is on the table, that invading Turkey and that harassing Turkey would not end well, that no matter how much you fortify these contested islands, will take over, and saying you've better learn the lesson from history and that Greece would be no match for Turkey. So, very typical Erdogan rhetoric, and he's only increasing this as the world becomes more unstable, as Turkey becomes less and less focused because let's just say even at the beginning of 2022, before Ukraine broke out into full conflict, if statements like this were being made, which they have been made in similar ways before, it, a lot of attention would be on Turkey at this time. In fact, you had a similar instance in 2020 and 2021 where you had this rhetoric coming from Erdogan, which faced a much harsher European response. Now, thus far, France, Italy, and a number of other smaller European nations have sent their fleets to the Aegean in order to, quote unquote, monitor the situation, to borrow a phrase from Donald Trump. And that has increased further. Now, this is at a time when NATO has supposedly never been more united. You have the thread which could be its unraveling coming to a head. And people have speculated, especially in the past few months, that the Cyprus situation could escalate, that you do have tensions growing there. So I wouldn't say, personally, that we're on the brink of another Greek Turkish war, but if the events of the next few years do continue to take rapid turns as they do, it's certainly not an impossibility. This is the closest that it has been in decades since the actual invasion of Cyprus itself, I would say. But this situation only tends to get more and more out of hand. And I will once again reiterate what I've been saying for the past almost 5 years on this show, that the crux of NATO is Turkey. That it is the most vital part of American geostrategy in Europe vis a vis Russia. It is the most geographically significant place in NATO, and you continue to have them waffle between East and West. And this is also on top of Erdogan making some very conciliatory comments about Russia. So he had also said that Russia is not an ordinary state, it is a powerful state. Of course, the West, especially America, is attacking Russia almost without limits. Against all this, of course, Russia is resisting. And Erdogan had continued, we wonder how we can open a peace corridor from here, as we did with the grain corridor. We think that the best way to be is dialogue for to peace. Of course, the opinions of Putin alone are not enough here. We also must meet with Zelensky, blah blah blah. Erdogan trying to play mediator in this
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
conflict, and
Yes.
there actually were tentative U.S. Russia talks on the issue of nuclear arms a couple days ago. So you are seeing,
That's right. Burns, head of the CIA, he was actually in Kiev the day that the missile hit Poland. Just something to think about. And he met with I think Petrushev, who's in charge. Don't quote me, but I think it's Petrushev. He met with him as well. I mean, the Russians and the Americans have had like, let's say, discrete dialogue all along.
Oh, of course, and they've had it since before the beginning of this war. And you'll recall that Putin and Biden met just a week before the attempted color revolution in Kazakhstan. And
Hmm.
with that, again, you have Turkey playing this interesting game where they're trying to position themselves as the mediator of this conflict. They think they can be the ones to broker peace, which they very well might be, depending on the direction this goes. All while taking a much more anti-Western stance than they have in several years. I don't attribute much to the saber rattling at Greece for the time being, but I will say that it is a marked change in rhetoric that we have not seen in decades.
Hmm. And the other big news, of course, in Turkey is the terrorist attack
Yes.
in Istanbul. So something like over 20 injured, six dead. The perpetrator was a woman who had a backpack filled with explosives and left it on their sort of main avenue, one of the most popular tourist areas. It's filled with people. She's been caught. Apparently, according to the Turks, she was trained in the U.S. She is a Syrian, and I believe she's a Kurd.
Yes,
Uh,
that's what I have here. That she is a Syrian national that had previously worked with Kurdish militants, and I didn't see the part about training in the U.S., but especially if she had cooperation with Kurdish militants in the past, that would not be a surprise.
yeah,
And
I,
it's also
I
alleged
mean,
that she
I think
confessed to ties to the Kurdistan Workers' Party.
right. I mean, the way I read it is when Turkey says that she's been trained in the U.S., they're basically preparing for the U.S. Like they're giving the little finger to the U.S.
Oh, completely.
Right? How do they know this? Turkey is willing to just like maybe it's true, maybe it's not. Um, but Turkey is letting a cat out of a bag at this moment when they say that. And what backs it up is that later, when Blinken gave his condolences, Erdogan rejected it. I've never seen Turkey reject any kind of condolences from the U.S. I'd have to jog my memory to go back to 2016 when the Americans
I can't
failed
think of any
with their,
instance off the top of my head. No.
but no, not since not in the last 6 years, not once. And so I think that was very telling. That Erdogan is signaling that America is the enemy. They are responsible for this. Uh, this is a big move because even they're showing interest in BRICS or the Shanghai Association. So, I mean, I think Erdogan has already kind of decided where he wants to take Turkey. It does not mean he's going to leave NATO because he will gain more power by having, literally both feet in the East and West. Uh, I wonder if the Americans, I think, are not willing to empower Turkey. They could in order to uh, use Turkey against Russia, but at the moment, Turkey does not have a leader that is willing to obey the stick. Because America, of course, part of the reason this is happening is America no longer has any more carrots; it has sticks. uh, Countries are dumping the dollar. America believes that they can intervene everywhere because of the Bretton Woods Agreement post World War II. And then the petrodollar in, I think it was 72 or 73. Wherever the American dollar is traded, they should be allowed to decide what happens. And what you have is the world is gradually moving away from using the petrodollar, right? So India set up nine different banks to trade exclusively with Russia in rupees and rubles. Uh, Turkey has already done that
No,
to a
I just want
limited
all of you to
degree.
keep in mind that the reason Saddam and Gaddafi were removed from power, at least the most likely reason, is because they wanted to trade oil in either the euro in Iraq's case or gold in Libya's
Yeah,
case. And now you
that's right.
have countries en masse all across the world dumping the dollar. Now, not fully, but again, they are moving away from the dollar. They're moving away from American economic hegemony. And after a certain point, and perhaps, and I could say with near certainty, that the conflict in Ukraine was the point that kicked this all off, that these countries realized if they act as a bloc, if they do it en masse, if all of them do it, of course, the American empire, as powerful as it is, they can't stage coups or invade all of us at the same time, and it becomes an impossible task,
That's right.
especially with much more significant countries like India, like Saudi Arabia, with countries that actually have weight to throw around. Not that again, Iraq or Libya were necessarily backwards countries. They weren't the poorest and the most insignificant in the world, but
That's right.
they were very, very minor players that arguably had outsized influence because of the men that were in power at the time. But again, it becomes a much more daunting task to punish India, in which case, again, we've opted not to punish India, than it is to punish Iraq or Syria or Libya or any of these, or even a country like Iran when they have chosen to do this. Of course, the timing does follow as well with the past, you could say, decade at least of failures for the American empire that after a certain point, it is almost unimaginable if you told somebody upon the outbreak of the Iraq War or the overthrow of Gaddafi that within 10, 20 years, American countries are going to be dumping the American dollar, moving away from American economic hegemony. So, just to put that in perspective.
Yeah, it's good that you mentioned that. I guess they were real pioneers. Um, uh, I would say the biggest shock, I think, to the U.S. I have just 2 points to add on to this. And the first is the biggest shock to the U.S. is the way India and Saudi Arabia have handled this whole situation. I think that has actually completely surprised them. I think the US was counting on creating more divisions between India and China, and that hasn't worked out. To a lesser degree, I think they've been surprised by Saudi Arabia. Uh, Saudi Arabia is more I would say they're more bound. Now they've taken steps. They are trading with Russia in rubles, but I would say those two countries have, I think, before this war started. Because the other thing I think to remember is that America is the actor in this war. It is the initiator, the protagonist. Russia is the reactor. It is not acting, it is reacting, right? Which is why the script has to look the opposite of that. Not just for propagandistic reasons, because it lends more empathy towards Ukraine. I mean, after all, they're the country who has to suffer the most in this. But um, it's easier to score wins when, or like, let's say we look at it this way. If you've lost parts of Donbass and Crimea, and then 8 years later, the war goes super hot, and you start to lose two other regions, right? That doesn't, like, if you're the instigator, right? That doesn't look very good. That's not a win, right? But if you make it appear as if you're the one who is reacting, you're not the instigator, you're not the protagonist, then it's more acceptable, right? That's why Milley, for instance, even today said there is almost zero chance that Russia is going to fulfill its objective to take over all of Ukraine. Well, I mean, Russia was never
Oh no,
saying it
it
was
was
going to
complete
take.
gaslighting. He did this at the beginning of the war, saying Kiev will
Yeah.
fall in 3 days, and it's again making claims on behalf of Russia that were never made in order so when they do not fulfill those
Yes.
claims, they
Yeah.
look weak. And of course, once again, America being the actor, having the let's just say narrative power behind them, they're able to pull those kind of maneuvers.
Right. Right. It conceals America's strength, but it also conceals its weakness. And so I think they, going into this war, as the protagonist, as the instigator. I think they did not count on India and Saudi Arabia siding with Russia and China. I think it's completely surprised them. The other thing I would say is, just to go back to Turkey, but it applies to all these countries. If you look at it from a metaphysical point of view, the death of liberalism that we're seeing, what it does for these countries is it brings back the possibility of the historical process again, right? In a sense, after the fall of the Soviet Union, all these countries have had to at least play lip service that they've come to the end of history. And it is why America, for instance, right now only has a stick. And that stick is gay rights, trans rights. You must be like us. You must conform to our values. We will make your life for your country a living hell financially and economically speaking. And we'll get into Iran as well because now they're arming rebels in Iran. Iran could be on the verge of a civil war. So I would say the allure of returning to the world as it has been for millennia upon millennia for historical nations is too tempting. That
Oh,
they want
absolutely.
that. That means something to them. They are an actual ethnos. They are not a propositional nation. They are not just materialist bugmen. They don't want that process. They want the other process, the historical process.
And I'll just say from a much more immediate sense, I actually agree with a lot with what you've said. That's the point I've actually been trying to make for a while, and I co-sign everything you just said. When it comes to when you start to see fractions of the system, when you start to see that the system is not infallible, the Fukuyama end of history turned out to be complete crock. Just from an immediate sense, when you have these nations that are stuck in this middling position, whether that be Russia, China, or even ones that are smaller like Iran, Turkey, etc., it's just a matter of opportunity. It's either we can be stuck in this secondary or tertiary position in the case of a lot of these nations under the current American system, under the current system of the world, or once again, we could return to that historical process, actually define our own identity, and actually have room to maneuver our nation and bring it to a greater presence, both once again from that medical physical sense, from that sense of an ethnicity, from that sense of being a historical people, and even from the sense of just raw terms in terms of this is what our economy looks like. This is how much sway our nation has in its region and around the world. And I would say Turkey is the prime example of that. If you don't, and I would even compare that to Russia and China in terms of nations that are looking to break the mold and return to that, as you put it, historical process. That Turkey, of all of them, is probably the most definitive. I mean, this is a founding member of NATO. This is a country that instituted secular republicanism on its own post World War One. This is a country that has been lauded up until the past few years as a model Islamic country. See, it can be a modern liberal democracy even with the majority Muslim population, only to see that all undone over the course of 5 to 10 years, you could say. I would say at least since 2016 with the failure of the coup that was almost certainly backed by the U.S. And it does, and I do think also on that note, Turkey is a model for other nations in that regard, love them or hate them, that these changes can be undone. And you could even, and we'll get into this in a minute here, even look at Iran
Uh,
as a precursor to that. I mean, they did that back
yes,
in the 1970s because they were also
yeah.
lauded as an example of modernization in the Middle East and the Islamic world. That I mean, although they weren't a I mean, there was a point in which Turkey was a legitimate quote unquote democracy, but Iran was always. Yeah, I mean, they had the Shah, they had whoever. It was a top down state, it was an autocratic state. And you could argue actually the current Islamic Republic is more democratic. Not that I really care about that one way or another. But you could look at that as a precursor to that in terms of rejecting what the world has put before you. Now, that was a much different world. That was the height of the Cold War. You had two competing systems that were, again, very similar to each other if you just want to look them on paper. Now, how that actually manifests itself in the Soviet Union and in the Western world, respectively, that's a completely different conversation. But again, you're seeing a path for a new world being paved once again from that metaphysical, from that historical perspective, and even in the most immediate terms, which I do believe most people focus on and that we hyper focus on.
Right. China is another example where it looked like it was going to do it, and then no, it didn't do it. Um, so some countries started this process earlier than others, but I think what they're sensing now is they can they can get their future back by continuing their historical process. Because I think they look at like how transformed Europe is by American influence, and now that's accelerated, uh, and they don't want that. Their grievances are different, let's say, compared to African countries where, as we've said before, the Chinese come in and they build hospitals and roads and bridges and railroad tracks for us, but you just lecture us, and you have to accept gay marriage if you want this loan from the IMF, and then a Westerner, usually a politician or somebody from an American think tank, will say something. Yeah, but it comes at the cost of this, and it's like, yeah, we know there's costs. You're just lecturing us all over again, right? So, and that process really has been going on all along in the 2000s, and it's just picking up speed right now.
It really is. And look, maybe we need to do a complete retrospective on this and track this, and perhaps our 2022 in review show will give us some sort of insight into this. But again, you do look at this. The world of the 1990s was more or less a facade. Now, that facade was undone by 9/11, the War on Terror, and all these subsequent events, but you look at once again, the Fukuyama vision of the world, I'll call it for lack of a better term, where it was just this global neoliberal democracy. I mean, keep in mind that many people have called it, and you've probably heard the term, the unipolar moment when America had the entire world by the balls, more or less. I mean,
Yeah.
at that point, you still had the war in the Balkans. You still had the fate of Russia, which was completely undecided with the Chechen wars and the political upheavals there. You had China rising, which a lot of people thought China was going to modernize and liberalize and democratize. Although, looking back, hindsight 2020, they were far off from that. I mean, they were closer than they are today, but they were still completely far off from that. Not to mention the various situations in Latin America and the Middle East still dominated by rival power blocs. Saddam Hussein, although crippled by the Gulf War, was still a force to be reckoned with, at least compared to his neighbors like Saudi Arabia, like Iran. Once again, you also had Iran. Although they were cooperative with the West, you still had the Gulf states. So the illusion of the 90s, while once again it was the height of American power, and they will never attain that level of power again. It was a facade that there was just this global American victory, bolstered by the fall of the Soviet Union, gave this temporary sense of relief, but once again, that was very quickly undone as soon as they had to face the next substantial crisis.
Hmm.
But with that being said, I suppose we've teased enough to get into the news about Iran, and I believe that this most recent one makes four terrorist attacks within the course of what the past 3 months.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
I believe that this most recent terrorist attacks makes the fourth one within the course of just these past 3 months,
Yeah, and it's 40 dead so far.
and that one was in, I believe, the quote unquote Azeri regions, which are very demographically mixed there. But of course, this is on top of months of protests that initially started over that one case of the woman dying in police custody, which led to that, which again looked pretty routine. It seemed like something that the Iranians do every few years. You recall similar protests all the way back in 2018. Then you had these rash of terrorist attacks come about, and now all of a sudden you're getting this story that the Iranian regime is going to sentence 15,000 people to death for their role in these protests. And it's it's just an absurd number on the face I mean, look, I will concede this much, and I'll do so begrudgingly. Out of all the countries that still have a death penalty, the Iranians are the ones who actually use it on a semi-regular basis. But the idea that they're just going to have a mass execution of 15,000 people is completely out of a propaganda mill. And I believe that this is
Yes.
actually. I think that Western media even recanted on this and said, no, that the quote unquote fact checkers, as unreliable as they are, actually came out and said that this simply is not the case. And as you had alluded to, that you're actually seeing militants on the ground being armed, and you're seeing further American involvement there to the point where they, in recent weeks and months, have actually dragged John Bolton out of his relative obscurity
Yes.
to talk about the possibility of regime change in Iran. At this point, they know they need to act. They know that they have created a power block that is really going to be almost impossible to crack if they don't do something, and they are attacking the weakest link in that, which is Iran, because they've tried to assail Russia, although Russia's performance in the war in Ukraine has been far from ideal, at least from on their end, or hell, even anyone's end at that point. The situation with China is still stagnant. Nothing has really happened with Taiwan or any of the other contested areas in East Asia. Iran is the one area that they can actually make headway in. You saw this from the beginning of the I mean, hell, you want to go all the way back to the JCPOA in 2015. You saw the attempts for an agreement there. Then the ultra Zionists have Trump's ear. They get him to tear that up, which, in retrospect, although I doubt Iran would have become a part of the American sphere, although I doubt that Americans would have won a soft conquest of Iran, it would have at least kept them enough on the fence in order to prevent a power block like this being formed. You had Trump, from an ill advised perspective of the American empire, tear that up. One of the first things diplomatically Biden does when he comes back in office is try to revive this thing, and he's still trying to revive this as we speak. There's still ongoing negotiations constantly over the JCPOA and what its future is going to look like. But after a certain point, although they haven't officially given up on negotiations, you can tell that they're enacting their backup plans, that they realize this has failed, and that they need to take more, let's call them extreme measures, to break up this power block, which is returning to form, returning to the old ways, and provoking armed rebellion within the country.
Yeah, I mean, America really has to go for broke here because uh, there are all kinds of things that are coming out about Iran that I think are really beginning to worry the Americans and the Israelis. And we'll just mention a few that some I've already mentioned. One, they are manufacturing turbines for gas and oil pipelines, and they delivered 40 of them to Russia. They are trading now, not only with forget the name of the Iranian dollar, what the name of their currency, but they're trading in their own currencies. Um, it is believed that about 50 Su-35s have been delivered now to Iran. We already know about the drones that Iran has given Russia, although lately, the last week, I'm noticing really almost all the drones that are taking out Ukrainian military hardware are done with the Lancet, which is the Russian drone. And we all know that that trading corridor that Russia has with Iran vis-a-vis the Caspian Sea leaves Iran basically impervious to like all kinds of uh, you know tactics by the U.S. to stop trade. Now, that isn't to say that that isn't happening. I believe the Americans either stopped or attacked a Iranian tanker that they believed had lubricants for missiles. I haven't seen too much about it. Now, if they're trading with their own denominations and Russia is modernizing Iran's military, I mean, this is this is a big deal. I'm not even talking about the $40 billion that they're going to invest in, um, oil and gas. I don't know if those pipelines are going to go like across the Persian Gulf. Maybe they'll go over Pakistan. Maybe they'll go north and they'll exit somewhere else towards China. I don't know. Russia has opened up a pipeline now with Mongolia. Um, but that is in the works. And so Russia's modernizing their oil and gas infrastructures and their military. Iran is doing likewise by supplying important turbines for these pipelines that are being built in Russia. Um, all they need right now is a connector between themselves and India, and that's Pakistan. And we discussed on the show last week where they tried to assassinate Khan because he's not out of the picture. He gets in, under a populist mandate, and he starts turning Pakistan around. I mean, Pakistan has been a very important project for the Americans, and I'm not just talking about 9/11. um,
Now, what would you ever be
Anybody who knows
implying?
a little. So that's a very big deal, and because that eschews the waterways that the Americans control. So Iran is a very big deal. You can see why Bolton is proud to tell you that, oh yeah, we're arming the rebels. They need a civil war. They need a civil war in Iran. I would say at the moment, Iran still has the upper hand. They need the will to bring the hammer down, because look, these people who are protesting are just being spun by the Americans. They're being given spun stories by the Americans about how uh, Iran will be even more incredible if we took over. It's just utter nonsense. Um, that's a kind of an ad hoc reasoning, because they probably have issues with Iran's religious regime. Um, but I think we're going to see Iran um, make an economic turn. And the sooner that happens, the worse it is for the US, or the US right now really, really has to pull something off there, right? Because for the Russians, for instance, when you're looking at artillery, like you're looking at the Grad rockets, well, that one rocket has like 40 little warheads in it, and so on and so on, and they're not as accurate. Now, Russia has some MLRS systems that are as accurate, or almost as accurate as America's best systems. However, it's faster and much cheaper to take out important infrastructure and enemy military targets with drones, right? And this is, in many ways, this is changing the war fundamentally in Ukraine.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, this all did start once the deals for the Iranian Shahed drones did take full force, and allegedly the Russians paid for those with a pallet of, maybe they learned this from Obama, with a pallet of 140 million in cash, as I'm sure the conservatives will never let you forget that. Oh, pallets of cash, blah blah blah, and
Which
captured
was
what
their own money, anyways. They just unfroze their money and
and
gave it back
and
to them.
and,
Oh no, that's
and captured Western weapons
it's
is the exchange that they made for the initial production of for the initial Shahed drone fleet. So you do see that underway. And again, the clock is ticking, and they are running out of time to do anything with Russia and China, and even Iran at this point. Which, like I said, it's the weak one. It's the one that they are going to pick off first. But that is all the news I had about the Middle East, and I do have quite a bit of domestic news relating to the U.S. If you're ready for that.
yeah.
So the midterm elections, in which we're still waiting for the full results, were a gridlock, more or less. So the House was taken in a slight majority. The Senate, in all likelihood, is going to either be a 51-49 split or revert back to the 50-50 split. You had Republican losses in key states like Pennsylvania, Nevada, and Arizona, all of which I predicted would go red. Now, of course, I would never contest the legitimacy of election results because I trust in our democratic process fully, and I wouldn't want to violate the terms of service on YouTube at the highest priority there. So I'll just say that much. I was wrong there. Georgia is going into a runoff, which, like 2020, will determine the balance of the Senate, whether it stays at the 50-50 or whether Democrats take a slight majority. But at the end, as I had said the day after the midterms, now that we have more conclusive results, it is a complete gridlock, which is arguably a good thing. I think the less power the American empire has to go in any direction or any process is good because I don't expect much change from electoral politics anyway. So if we can just bog down the system, I think that might just be the best alternative. And upon that, you had Donald Trump come out and announce his 2024 campaign, and that was after a series of various statements, provocative statements made towards several Republican candidates, which the primary one he went after was DeSantis, which has been fielded as a potential replacement or successor for Trump ever since he had lost the election. So you have Trump coming out trying to recreate the magic of his 2016 or 2015 announcement for 2016, but the magic simply is not there. He came out with a lot of the
Mm-hmm.
rhetoric. Funny enough, no mention of the wall, not that I saw at least, not that I recall at least. And the the most provocative thing he said is that he said he wanted to seek the death penalty and execution for convicted drug dealers, which I mean, I don't necessarily oppose, but when that's your most controversial piece of Trump rhetoric, it is pretty weak, all things considered. It was just more of what you've expected, and a lot of people don't like it when I say this, but Trump has become a creature of the system. Not that he ever really wasn't one. He was transgressive, I mean, but you look at the man and his life and the people he had affiliations with before, he's always been at least tangentially a part of the system, but they've completely assimilated him. You might be lucky to get some good rhetoric out of him, but given his recent speech and his recent tirades, I mean, even his tirades against some of these Republican candidates, those used to be funny when he did those. Maybe my sense of humor has changed, or maybe the actual content of what he's saying has changed, or maybe the context has changed. But point being is, the shock value and the entertainment value that once existed with Donald Trump is gone. It is out the window.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
I can only expect this is once again part of this rehabilitation that if they need to, they will allow him back into power to do what needs to be done to do the dirty work. And with the situation in Iran looking like it's going to boil over, there was an interesting piece of news that came from Trump's statements that perhaps it's a bit of a stretch to connect to. Trump said that he is going to let the unvaccinated members of the military who lost their positions because they didn't take it back into their previous positions to reinvigorate the military. Now, chalk that up to political pandering, chalk that up to whatever. That sounds like a man who wants to rebuild a military for actual use. And I've speculated for a while now. It's bounced around whether that be the situation with Taiwan, whether that be Ukraine, whether that be Iran, whether that be whatever the hot zone is at the time, that Trump would be let back in primarily to take the heat for another American intervention, and that he would be able to rally a lot of the right wing elements, rally a lot of the elements of people who actually would be fighting the wars, who would be, again, more or less right wingers, and although they may not call themselves that, people who would have nationalistic views about the United States. So, and again, maybe I'm pushing this too far, maybe I'm speculating far too much on this. If I had to look at the situation objectively, that Donald Trump is being rehabilitated so they can ramrod through more things under the cover of he gets to make fun of journalists at press conferences sometimes, and he gets to do his Trump-like mannerisms. And a lot of people say, well, that's exactly what DeSantis is. Well, I don't care. Number one, I couldn't care less about DeSantis. Sure, yeah, there's been some good policies in Florida at the state level under him, but that's ultimately relevant to what electoral politics actually is, which I believe there's absolutely zero. I believe there's less than zero solutions in electoral politics, as evidenced by the defector Republicans who signed on to the Respect for Marriage Equality Act or whatever the hell it is. That's a topic in and of itself that I won't bore you with tonight. But again, they are building up the GOP. While you may have this fiery rhetoric where you have the dark brand in the speech or the finger wagging by various Democrats or whatever. Well, at the end of the day, that I mean, it's all part of the game. They need to build up the Republicans as this they need them to be a more believable controlled opposition. I'll just put it that way. And the man to do that job at this point is Donald Trump. Like I said, I'll say once again, not that I think DeSantis or anyone else is really the solution to any of this. They're the runners up. They'll allow them to be the runners up if for some reason Trump can't run, if he ends up in a cell or has a heart attack before 2024 or whatever. But point being is, they're allowing a lot of these new crops of Republicans to come up, and whether they have won their elections, lost their elections, but they're trying to in my opinion, while there is some grassroots support behind this, they're trying to simulate the idea of an overhaul of the GOP to be once again a more effective and believable controlled opposition because the old guard, whether it be somebody like a Paul Ryan, Mitch McConnell, who also was confirmed that will be the leader of the Senate Republicans yet again, uh, they have served their purpose. All the juice has been squeezed out of them. They need some fresh blood that they can use to further those narratives. And a lot of people will fall prey to that. A lot of people will think there's been a genuine shift in the Republican Party because they talk about more about immigration or demographics or anti-woke stuff or whatever the pet issue is. Not that those things aren't important, don't get me wrong, but to believe that any of these people that on the floor of Congress or whatever elected office they may have actually get up and talk about these issues, to believe that they will actually move the needle in the slightest, I think is a very, very optimistic position, far more optimistic than I'm comfortable with. And I'll say once again, I don't think that these people are master manipulators. They're good enough manipulators to get the job done. But if I had to give you my 100% honest opinion, they're shifting to a rebranded control opposition in which
Yeah.
Donald Trump will be the face, and if they can't get Donald Trump to do it, they'll get DeSantis to do it, or they'll find somebody who has gained some level of notoriety in the past few years to do it.
Yeah, I mean, I listened to the speech. It was underwhelming. He was using 2016 talking points in many ways. He did not. You talked about he didn't even bring up the wall, but he didn't address, I think, some of the like a- in his election, basically 2020. When you look at COVID and um, let's say the Floyd riots, a lot of people want answers to that. He has to convince them that he really will be president when he's in the White House. He won't just be a figurehead. He's not going to be there just to trigger the journalists because that's old now. It's over, right? And that's what people witnessed. They saw that the real sovereign cannot be a Republican president unless he's someone like a George Bush Jr. or a senior. Uh, and Trump. I think for the American empire, there are many who will not want him to re-enter the race, even if that means the destruction of the Republican Party. Because geopolitically right now, the situation that America is in, it cannot. I don't think it can handle like a George Floyd riot with an economy that's in recession,
Oh, absolutely not.
and
And
a,
and
like
of course they're
that's out of the
downplaying the
question.
level of recession. And I mean,
Yeah.
it was tenuous enough in 2020 in terms of just political stability, but yeah, if they were going to attempt something like that on that scale, again, it would be, for lack of a better term, it would be crossing a Rubicon.
Yeah. And I don't. I mean, I don't think they'll let him run, but I think if he does, the support won't be there. It's gone. Um, I think what was painful for a lot of white voters was that they saw their businesses destroyed, but he decided to give, what was it, 5 billion to black-owned businesses that
Yeah,
were
I think
destroyed.
it was. Oh, I think it was like five
This is
hundred
even more than
billion.
that. It was huge. It was an enormous amount. And then
Yeah,
Biden
the
just built on
platinum
that.
plan or whatever it was.
That's it, the platinum plan. And Biden just built up on that by excluding white men from being able to get access to grants and loans to rebuild their businesses. It was such a betrayal. If you believe the exit polls in 2020, um, Trump lost 5% of the male vote. Now you look at the midterms and you see how many how white people are gradually moving more towards the Republican Party, and so are Hispanics. But this I think forget about January the 6th and why didn't he cross the Rubicon. Uh, he didn't act the way he was supposed to act during the riots, and his boasting of, I came up with the vaccine, nobody cares and nobody likes that you did.
I
Number
mean, if
one.
you even want to go back before 2020 and the boiling point there, I mean, keep in mind there were what 3 or 4 different crises on the border with migrant caravans that he.
Yeah.
Now, although it wasn't the level that a lot of people feared it would be, it was still a weak performance from the man who said "build the wall" and who made all the let's just say inflammatory remarks that he did at the beginning of his election campaign. So it was all of that just compounded on top of that. But when you have your own streets being burned down and then you refuse to act, it again, like what's the most he did? He stood outside of that one church in D.C. and held the Bible upside down. Big, oh,
and
that
and then
was
the
yeah.
church condemned him for doing it,
Yeah, and I'm pretty sure
because the
like
church is this totally shit-lived church.
oh
It's
yeah,
a shit-lived church.
it's one of those rainbow flag Episcopalian ones. I think they actually
Yeah.
when they show it any other time, they do have that rainbow flag outside of it. So it's not not any surprise at all. And
Yeah,
then
it was a farce. It was comical, but not for the reasons the liberals think it was.
oh, absolutely not.
Um, yeah. So uh, he lost the confidence, and I think the biggest reveal was that he had no sovereignty. When General Milley gets 8 or 9 other generals to sign on, um, saying that they will not help Trump with the interfere with the democratic process. None of the governors where this violence was happening, and it was widespread, agreed to bring in the reserves, the guards.
And if you allow me to
Um,
dog on Trump just a little bit more,
and that wasn't the case with Obama. Pardon me.
if you allow me to dog on Trump just a little bit more, going back to J6, you'll recall that Mike Pence was actually the one who authorized the crackdown on it,
Yeah,
and that was behind Trump's
yeah.
back. And well, it shows his judge of character that he keeps these kind of people around him. Mike Pence, who was supposedly renowned for his loyalty and that he would get the job done if he had a personal commitment or professional commitment to whoever. And oh, Trump won't surround himself with snakes this time. Well, who's he going to surround himself with then? Honestly. And then people were talking about, well, oh, Jared Kushner and Ivanka probably won't be part of the new administration. Oh, big deal, big
Well,
deal.
that's great,
I mean,
but
yeah,
but
I'll take what I can get, but you really think whoever is going to be replacing them is going to be any better in any real sense? You think we're going to see any actual moving the needle? But no, I mean, I will reiterate for a third time. This is not an endorsement of DeSantis or whoever, whatever Republican challenger there is, if any. Donald Trump 2024 is a complete farce, and look, I can't tell you what to do personally, but I I'm not going to be fooled by it. I'm not going to fall for it, and perhaps you could say this is defeatist, this is blackpilling. Well, if that's the case, it took you about 4.5 years to notice. But yeah, that the mo of this program. But again, I see no solutions in electoral politics generally, and particularly no solutions in Donald Trump 2024.
Yeah. Um, and it was like everybody understands Kushner is the guy that kept him in check. He's the guy that told him not to call for the. Please forgive me. It's obviously it's not the Coast Guard, but
National
the
Guard.
other reserves, National Guard, right? So he's the one that told him to not call for the National Guard, to give black businesses and like this huge sum of money in order to win their votes. And what did he do? He alienated the demographic that literally helped him get elected, which was white men. And uh, so you have all these examples that prove he didn't even have power when he was there, and we'll never know like um what things he would. I mean, another example, when they lied to him about how many troops were in Syria, and you have all these shit libs cheering on the fact that there are more troops in Syria. Like, why? I mean, well, because he's obviously not on their side. If Obama decided to leave Syria, their tune would change completely. Um, so, um, I mean, anybody in 2022 that still thinks like there's any hope, uh, there's no more hope in the Republican Party there than there is for Brits for the Tory Party.
Oh no, to reiterate, these are filtration systems. These are the ones where they bring in the people
Yeah,
who otherwise would be effective if they were given the proper power and authority that a democratic system promises them. And it takes them, it moderates them. I'll to put it bluntly, it castrates them and turns
yeah.
them into uh, loyal party servants. Now, a few will slip through the cracks, but I mean, let's be honest. How much influence does Rand Paul have on national politics except when he is doing a 12-hour filibuster or grilling Fauci? Which things I do support. I do have a soft spot for him because of my former
Yeah.
libertarian days, but I'm not going to pretend like he is this great influential force in American politics. I mean, again, he's the designated contrarian. I'm not going to go as far as to call him controlled opposition, but I'll just say he's a loud opposition.
Right, and I think to some degree he understands that. Um,
Oh,
you're right.
believe
I
me,
don't want to take anything away.
if I were put in the position, I would be the designated contrarian. Like I said, I think out of everyone in American politics, he's one of the few. Like, if I actually had to, like, say for example, appoint an emperor, he would be on the short list. I'll just put it that way. But
Yeah,
in terms of actual effectiveness, I'm not gonna pretend like Rand Paul or like somebody or like any of these senators or congressmen or governors who may like on these isolated cases may actually be good at what they do. Now governors may be so because they have much more influence over their individual states, but I'm not gonna pretend like they're going to pull America's ass out of the fire.
yeah, yeah. Um, yeah, it's regrettably a hopeless situation.
And like I said,
All you can do is I think there is that doesn't mean there's no planning, but you have to plan like really long term, like past this century kind of planning.
look, and I may sound callous about this, and this is because it's been something that's taken me a very long time to come to this conclusion, but I don't take any joy in saying this. I'm not reveling in the fact that I'm living in a country that's falling apart and completely politically ineffectual, in which case that a country that doesn't represent me at all. Of course I don't like that, but after a
Hmm.
certain point, the mournfulness, the so-called blackpilling does wear off, and you can really only address it from a very callous, cold manner. And if I come off that way, I do apologize, but I'm just trying to be completely honest with all of you.
Yeah, I mean, there was what was it today that the Republicans messed up on that
Yeah, that Respect for
their
Marriage
Marriage
Equality
Act,
Act. Yeah.
like they, they even had like 12 of their own go to the opposition side. It's just it's beyond pathetic.
Yeah, but speaking of just more absurd news out of the U.S., I just wanted to get a little bit into this FTX scandal. Now, I'll be the
Yeah.
first to know. I know absolutely nothing about finance, and then you bring in cryptocurrency. I am completely in over my head, but I wish I had the graphic with me, but it more or less goes that you have this financier named Samuel Bankman Fried. Now, I'll let you guess what his ethnic
Mm.
and religious extraction may be, but the man's last name is literally Bankman. He can't make this up. So, he is a massive donor to the Democratic Party, one of the biggest donors. I think actually the second behind Soros himself. And of course, the party apparatus brings in Biden. Biden, of course, gives billions upon billions of dollars in aid to Ukraine, which then uses part of that aid money to partner with FTX, and it just creates this wonderful little cycle. He gets busted for that. His partners in crime are no less absurd than himself. Apparently, one of them was a dedicated polygamist. It was just this. I'll just say, your average Jewish woman. That's how she looked, but it was just this. I mean, and this was to the tune of, I believe, about a $32 billion scandal that just came out. And of course, this man was slated to speak at all these financial conferences. He was viewed as, again, a respectable authority in this. And I'll be honest, just when this all first came out, I couldn't make really heads or tails of what the hell just happened, but I wasn't shocked, frankly. And look, it does make me wonder how significant the scandal actually will be long term. Of course, it will be swept under the rug after everyone gets done making fun of the way these people look. In which case, they do look like the kind of people you would expect to do this. I'm not just saying
Very
that because
dysgenic.
I'm not just saying that because the man's last name is Bankman Fried. It's actually unrelated to that, but it is because they just do generally look like scummy people, and the way they keep themselves, the way they present themselves, and again, that's beyond the angle of him being a Bankman Fried, which I just cannot get over the name Bankman. Of course, it's Bankman. I mean, look, if this were
I know it's
if this were a fiction story, I would simultaneously be called a bad writer and condemned by the ADL for making his name Samuel Bankman. But that that's that's aside the point here. Um,
yeah, I mean, uh, I saw a hilarious meme of you know, what a man who is like just barely scraping by what his girlfriend or wife looks like, and then she gradually gets better the wealthier he is. But when you get to billionaire, the billionaire's wife looks no different than the guy who's just struggling.
oh yeah, yeah. It does
I
come full
thought that was
circle where
one of the most hilarious things I've ever seen.
I mean, look at Melinda Gates. What's Bezos' now
Yeah.
ex-wife's name? Again, like I look. I'll be. Perhaps I'm getting into dangerous territory here, but I think Melinda Gates is sort of like a Michelle Obama situation if you pick up what I'm putting down. Um,
Yeah.
but with that being said, it is strange, and it does make you wonder. When you have that much wealth and power, it obviously does corrupt you. But does that corruption manifest on a physical level? One does have to wonder.
Yeah, like the lesson I get from that is aspire to be a millionaire, not a billionaire.
I mean, I would frankly agree, but if you have any more on that, certainly. But I just have a couple more pieces of U.S. news.
No, that's all I've got.
So you did have the U.S. agreeing to lift sanctions on the civil aviation sector with Russia, which shows once again just a vital American infrastructure and industries are suffering, and we are once again spiraling ever so closer to an energy crisis. So we're recording this as of November 17th,
Actually,
2022.
if I could just
Yeah,
quickly
no, go ahead, go
interject,
ahead.
now that you brought up the aviation thing, one of the we've discussed how important it is for America for its interest to completely cut off Europe from Russia. But there is a unique reason why they wanted Russia trade with Germany to cease. And that is, and this is kind of interesting because Russia's biggest trading partner in 1914 was Germany, and Germany's biggest trading partner was Russia. And in 1941, the same was true. So basically, Germany supplied to Russia a lot of metalworks and a lot of uh, engineering pieces. So machinery, basically, for factories.
Oh no, the Russian
And
German deal has always been airtight, where Germany has the technical and industrial skill, Russia has the raw resources, and it becomes a cycle of one another.
yeah, yeah, and that's yeah. But I find it interesting that every time that relationship gets too close, an Anglo country will make sure that it's destroyed.
Oh yeah, uh, and whether that, I mean, you actually go back to the probably initial case of that. It was Bismarck who dedicated a significant part, aside from unifying Germany. His goal in life was amicable German-Russian relations in order to
Hmm.
offset both French and Anglo influence. And then, of course, World War One breaks out, and then World War Two, and then you actually have De Gaulle, who suggested a Paris, Berlin, Moscow axis, in which case he does create that powerhouse by having that cyclical trade between France and
Yeah,
between Germany and Russia, with France intertwined with Germany as a result of post-war agreements. But you do see that, and I think it's also E. Michael Jones who loves to point this out, that yeah, every time, and you're seeing it happen once again, as you had just pointed out, that every time there seems to be a reconciliation between Germany and Russia and cooperation on an economic level, that they need to crack that in half. And this is probably the most aggressive we've seen it. Now, of course, the other two did lead to world wars and were part of world wars, but in terms of the actual effect that has been taking place in Germany before a military conflict even breaks out, it's probably the most drastic that has happened. And perhaps that was because there was an understanding that we could have a more integrated German Russian system now that the Cold War is over, now that World War II is over, now that we've come to the quote unquote end of history, that they were willing to tolerate that arrangement, that they were willing to let Germany become a powerhouse that way. But then, of course, they started to drift further and further. Crimea issue happens, and again, you have Germany, which, although they have been part of the Western system, have always been much more hesitant to go along with this. And you are seeing right now, with the destruction of German Russian relations and German Russian economic cooperation, Merkel's legacy going down the drain. Now, I've pointed that out before. Uh, Credit where credit is due, begrudgingly, one of Merkel's primary goals was that cooperation between Germany and Russia and creating a more independent bloc in that sense. And of course, once Schloss came to power, Schloss actually seemed like he was going to continue down that path. And of course, you actually go back through his Twitter archive, he's skeptical of the claims of Syria in 2013, 2017, and 2018. But ultimately, he balked the American empire. If we're being honest, put in a similar situation, Merkel probably would have balked the American empire. But it showed once again the Anglo American system pulling the levers and making sure that this system does not come to fruition. And probably in the most aggressive way we've seen, once again, since 1941. But with all that being said, it is interesting, and we had gotten into the civil aviation question where the Americans, again, they'll deprive a the Europeans of a cooperative relationship with Russia, but then they'll selectively lift sanctions for them, alleviate that burden, and then ship it back to Europe. Now, that happened with the civil aviation industry and related industries, and as we approach closer to a diesel shortage, you do have America still sending fuel exports to Europe. Reserves are at a 42-year low. This is the lowest they've been since, I believe, I think that was sometime in the late 70s, early 80s at the height of the energy crisis then. But you could conceivably see a situation, especially as quote unquote negotiations continue with the war in Ukraine, where some of the fuel burden is alleviated. U.S. lifts sanctions, some fuel gets shipped from the U.S. ships back to Europe at a massive markup. And as we're seeing that happen with aviation, it's not any stretch of the imagination that would happen with oil, gas.
Yeah. Um, I have to think that when this war is over, um, and this is why, like, I think for different reasons, both parties want this war to go on longer. But when this war is over, let's say it's over quickly. Actually, let's say within a year or two. I mean, I think, and all that happens is some kind of a truce. We don't know whether war will flare up again. 5, 6, 7, 8 years down the road. But let's say it stops, right? Germany and Europe will be furious with America, furious. Like, and this is why, again, I say over over and over, it's like America needs like a total victory just to not have Europe um, try to turn against it, because it's going to be officially winter in about a month, in a little over a month, and Europe is going to be tested,
Oh,
and
absolutely.
Europe's relationship with America will be tested.
The American empire needs to be able to show Europe that the cost that they paid came to fruition, that they actually
Hmm.
accomplished the goal, that your suffering had a meaning. But
Yeah,
even if it's just say a pyrrhic Russian victory, let's say it's like worst case scenario with Russia where they technically accomplished all their war goals but at a great cost, or again, anything short of, I would say, Ukraine at this point retaking Crimea is going to look like a pyrrhic Western victory at best, and it will call into question American European cooperation and saying that they had incurred that level of cost and for what. And we'll have to see how severe this winter is. We'll have to see what the actual impact of this winter is before we can speak any sooner on that. But
yeah.
I
Like,
mean,
again, I think, go ahead. Uh, Sorry. Again, if we look at it as America is the protagonist here and Russia is reacting, right? Then you understand that the goal is America must defeat Russia. It
oh,
must
absolutely.
oust Putin. It cannot, like, the war is global, but the actual theater of the fighting is in Ukraine. However, if the status quo remains as it is, but there's just less bullets flying, that's not good enough,
Oh, yeah, that's exactly what I was getting at. If
right?
anything short
Yeah, yeah,
of expunging Russians all the way up until Crimea is what they need in order to prove something. Even if Ukraine recovers the Donbass, even if Ukraine recovers everything but Crimea, if Ukraine doesn't restore itself to its pre-2014 borders, in which case it will be, in my opinion, viewed as a loss by the rest of the world. And as you're saying, if we're viewing America as the country with initiative in this, which I would agree, and I think most people watching or listening to this would also agree, then that is what needs to be done, and that is what needs to be
mhm,
done in order to justify the cost incurred by Europe. And anything short of that is going. I mean, you're already seeing a rift in relations, particularly between the U.S. and the U.K., which is surprising. When you saw the pound take the hit it did a few months ago, even in the best case scenario,
yeah,
there are going to be ties that have to be mended. But in the worst case scenario, you're looking at a complete Atlantic divorce.
right. Like, anything short of a regime change in Russia is is a defeat. It's a failure for America.
Oh yes.
Like, if that does not happen, anything that keeps the status quo going the way it is, where you have gradually more and more countries turning against America, not using the American dollar, allowing that $40 trillion debt, like, um, enact its sort of full force on the economy. Anything that keeps this trajectory going along the path that it is doomed for the West. Because like the to destroy Russia and to get the resources, right? Like Europe can get its oil and gas again, but only if you have Russia as a puppet state, right? That's the only way that can happen. And if that doesn't happen, then I don't know what.
Yeah, I think that's really the only way you can put that. It's all the domestic U.S. news I had. I suppose we do have a little bit about the G20 if you want to get into that this week.
Sure.
Well, the G20 occurred. Zelensky got his wish. Putin wasn't there. But in my opinion, there was really nothing remarkable at the G20 except there was some snubbing of Zelensky in light of this, which was entertaining. And you were actually filling me in on much more instantly, although they did not meet, some news about the G7 and just what a joke that organization has become. And
Yeah.
to the point where, when it comes to that, the top seven economies in the world did not make it to G7. The G20 is a shell of its former self. There wasn't, again, it's actually, in my opinion, significant because nothing happened. That used to get substantial, at least sideline meetings at the G20, but even that did not come to fruition. So you are seeing these institutions of the, let's just call it old New World Order, fade into irrelevance. Nobody cares about that. Nothing significant happens at these things anymore. What did they get up there? They talk about economic development and climate change, issues that are completely irrelevant. Nobody cares about these, especially in light of what has been happening recently. But in terms of issues that actually have an impact, issues people actually care about, amidst the missile crisis in Poland, you had North Korea test launch an ICBM and land it in South Korean waters. Tensions there are once again increasing, and that's on top of just generally the world has been going that direction. There was an interesting situation where, at the same time, Russia solicited buying ammunition from North Korea. The U.S. bought ammunition for Ukraine from South Korea as well, so the Russia-Ukraine war has become a Korean proxy war, which I think is mildly entertaining. But this is the second Korean missile test within the past couple months. They had the one that they fired over Japan that caused some alarm that ultimately didn't amount to anything, but it is a return to form that North Korea no longer sees any real progress to be made in negotiations with South Korea that they saw perhaps in 2017, 2018. And that's been evident for quite some time now. You had the destruction of some of the diplomatic offices along the DMZ, but I mean, it's clear that the Korean issue, at least in the near future, is not going to be solved diplomatically. I doubt the war on the peninsula is going to reignite, but it is just going to be a gradual whittling away. It's going to be just a contest to see who can endure for longer. In which case, I'll say it once again. I've said it before that North Korea, in my opinion, has much more longevity than the South, and perhaps that's just demographic reasons alone. But I think the direction the world is going, and perhaps if the American empire does take another major hit in credibility, that will make South Korea reconsider in terms of negotiation and cooperation with North Korea. But insofar as it's concerned, South Korea stands as a complete puppet of the American empire on the same level as a country like Germany, and we will not see any progress there for the near future until that fact changes. Now, perhaps it will take a flare up in East Asia for something like that to happen, but for the time being, it does seem that we've returned to a early 2010 status quo on the Korean Peninsula, with North Korea becoming more belligerent. Not really much you can do with South Korea. You don't even hear too often about the drills that come out of South Korea anymore, and those used to be a multiple times a year things where you have the joint U.S. Korean South Korean drills near the DMZ or in South Korea or whatever. But even those have subsided, and although you start to see a shift in focus on China, realistically, the U.S. is so bogged down in Ukraine that it can't make that effective pivot to focus on China. So it creates a very
Hmm.
strange situation there where you'll have to see some degree of resolution. Perhaps maybe that's why they're much more willing to broker some sort of peace, at least that's what they say, so they can shift focus to East Asia once again. But that's all the news I had for this week, unless I had left anything out or you have anything else.
Well, I just think it was funny because there was this run-in with Justin and Xi Jinping. Um, so at first you see this, this sort of gala setting for the G20, crowds everywhere, reporters, people with like name tags and stuff, leaders wearing, some kind of traditional Asian wear. And the camera starts running towards this particular throng of people, and it turns out it's Xi Jinping addressing Little Potato. That's what the Chinese call Trudeau, Little Potato.
Oh,
And
yes. I forgot about that one.
so, as it turns out, Xi Jinping is telling him, listen, what we said in our meeting is confidential. There is a time where you can release that to the press, but you have already leaked it. And what was Justin's reply? Well, you know, we are a Western liberal democracy, and in our country, we believe in freedom of, again, the lecturing. The lecturing. It reminds me when there was that Chinese US delegation that met for the Alaska summit. And again, the lecturing, trans rights, gay, like
The purple hair
non-stop.
delegate.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Constant lecturing. And it's like, you know, you guys aren't as strong as you think you are. And like, again, we want to return to a historical process, not your stupid ahistorical end of civilizational process, okay? Like you're just living in decadence. And like, you know, I love those memes where the places, the room is a wreck. You live like this. So so that's Justin, right? So he's completely smug. He has this moral answer as if that resonates with the world. A lot of people think this was staged. I don't believe this is staged. I believe all of them stick to the script. If you hear Blinken talking like that, you can be assured Schultz is talking like that, Baerbock, Sunak, Trudeau, they're all talking like that. Okay. They're not ever going to deviate from the script. In the way that you saw all these European countries side with America, no questions asked, uh, people uh, having a different point of view in Poland, Lithuania, Germany, they've been thrown in prison, they've been handed fines. Uh, that's the reality that you live in. Like, I don't know
And
why
that's
people,
not
I
including
don't
the
know why
ones who have
people,
just been unpersoned by private institutions like banks and whatnot.
right, right. I don't know why people self-aggrandize themselves like this, right? Like, oh yeah, they're doing this for you. I mean, yeah, there are gay ops, we understand, but not everything is a gay op. Like, you don't like, they don't think of you that much, okay? Uh, it's almost like the same people who will tell you that we got to just wake up the people are the same people who are telling you like all of this is done for to fool you because you're so clever, you're going to figure it out and turn things around. It's just such a warped, it's even a liberal idea, that notion that that's how power really works. In any case, what's most egregious about this moralizing, right, is you're supposed to believe, like, again, the West is a cult now. NATO is a cult. I said earlier, shit libs supported more troops in Syria. It's a cult. The reason it's a cult is because it is afraid. It's the system is stressed right now. And there are people who 10 years ago who belonged to a different political persuasion would not feel so fervently about some of the machinations that are happening geopolitically right now. And um, you're supposed to believe that Trudeau has never gone to a meeting that was strictly secret or partly secret, or the contents edited would be released to the press at an appropriate time, or the main talking points at an appropriate time. You're really supposed to believe that. Like in the West, where like you lose your job if you disagree with a whole number of things, like fortified elections, or your channel is taken down, or you're reported. Like you're really supposed to believe that that the West can afford a diverse set of opinions anymore and not get like freaked out by it. No, the West is incredibly insecure. And so, but it's the betrayal, right? It's the smugness, the inability to apologize, right? To accept the fact that you made an agreement and now you want to morally grandstand to say, well, I was right to do it because this trumps that. Um, you know, like the West is like, you know, uh, it's done. Like if they don't engage in some monstrous war, I don't see how anyone has any respect for it. Again, all they offer are sticks, and when they talk with their degenerate language and their degenerate values, it's literally just them threatening these countries. That's all it is. They know these countries don't want this, right? So there's no carrot. In other words, what they're probably when they talk like that, what they're probably saying is just like, maybe we're going to have to. What are the straits over past Indonesia towards India?
Um,
Ends of
it,
today. Anyways,
the name escapes me.
but you know the ones. It's where Chinese
Yes.
trade goes. Yeah, Argos. The name escapes me. I know what they'll do. They'll block those. That's how it will go, right? If they feel threatened, like I mean, we are in the midst of World War III right now. So, anyways, it's they're just pathetic. And of course, they released a video where Sunak and Trudeau are speaking on a phone together that they have laid out on the table. And they're talking to Zelensky. Hi, really sorry about the missile. It's like, look, dude, everybody knows it's his own stupid missile. Russia didn't like it killed two Poles. It didn't kill any
And a
Ukrainians.
tractor.
And it's literally his missile and a tractor and a tractor. You want to be really black pilled? No, I'm joking. So, anyways, I
I
just think
saw. To completely derail, I did see, and I should have brought this up earlier. One of the Russians posted a picture of a shell that they that they wrote on like for the Polish tractor.
yes, that's right. I saw that. I saw that. Oh my god, that was hilarious. Russians are good trolls. I gotta admit. Did you see what Medvedev did? He tweeted out the Polish president and said, "We can supply you with the finest air defense system in the world."
Oh,
Wow, brutal.
that's it. It is.
But-
You gotta respect the grind to a degree. But that's all I had for this week. Certainly interesting machinations all around.
Oh yeah. Yeah, that's all I have as well. And I just want to tell the audience and you, forgive me. I swore at the beginning of the show. I was kind of in a fake Putin character, but it's inappropriate. We're both Orthodox men, and I shouldn't have said that. So please forgive
I
me.
appreciate that, and if I had any editing skills, I would fix that. But alas, here we are. I'll just leave you with one last behind the scenes notes. I don't edit on principle. I like to give you what we
Yeah.
say. So like I'm not altering any of our words. We just upload the raw video files. So You just get to hear what we say, whether we stand by it or not. We have a record, and you know what? I'll recant. I know my good friend GSP here will recant, but I just like to give you the most honest experience possible. And well, thank you everyone for tuning into this episode of the War Report, and we'll see you guys next time. And goodbye.
Thank you and take care.